Hey everybody, today I'm going to show you how to make a set of parallettes in a fairly cost-effective way. If you don't know what parallettes are, basically, if you ever watched men's gymnastics, there's an apparatus called parallel bars. And if you take parallel bars and miniaturize them, you get parallettes, basically a miniature version of the parallel bar apparatus. Now, if you're a gymnast like myself, if you're a CrossFit enthusiast, or if you're just a person who likes to stay active, or you're an athlete of any form and you'd like to develop very lean muscle mass, strong core, as well as working handstands, things like that, parallettes are an essential piece of equipment that I always recommend to people. They're very simple, but very, very effective. And they can be pretty easy to make, but for some reason I see a lot of people buying them from different companies, and that doesn't make a lot of sense to me because I've seen them cost as much as $120, and that's just, to me, that's a little bit overpriced when you can make them yourself in a very easy way. Now, different people like different types of materials. Some like metal, some like wood, like myself, for example, and other materials. But personally, I prefer wood because as a gymnast, I like to use material that feels very close to what I'm going to be working on as part of my competitive lifestyle. So, but today, that's not what I'm going to show you how to use for making parallettes. I only point this out because wooden ones can actually be fairly versatile. I made these over 10 years ago, and I've had them obviously for quite some time now, and I've put a lot of mileage on them. As you can see, there's a lot of chalk on here, a lot of dirt. I've lived in 3 different countries over the past 10 years. I've had them in every country that I've lived in, and very, very useful, and I love them. But because that's not what I'm going to show you, I just wanted to show you, I brought these up to basically demonstrate what parallettes look like. So I'll put these away. I'm actually going to show you how to make parallettes using PVC pipe. Now, I know there are a lot of videos out there where people show how to make parallettes using PVC pipe, and you're probably wondering why this video is any more different than the other ones. And basically what it comes down to is that many of the videos that I saw, I was a little bit disappointed because they tend to recommend, in my opinion, one, the wrong size of PVC. If you're going to be using parallettes, especially as a gymnast, like I said, you want to have something that feels very close to the actual event, parallel bars. I'm going to tell you what size to pick so that it feels as close as possible, what kind of additional materials and adhesives and sizings that you should use so that the parallettes are actually very stable and they can actually be used in a very reliable way. So with that, let's get started with actually talking about each piece of material that you'll need. Okay, first things first, you'll need to buy or get 12 to 15 feet of 1 1/4 inch diameter PVC pipe. And when you get that PVC pipe, make sure that it says Schedule 40, rated for 370 PSI PVC pipe. That specification is important for the overall strength of the parallettes at the end of the day. And when you're looking at the diameter, make sure that you don't make the mistake of measuring, looking at the outer diameter of the PVC pipe. It's actually the inside diameter that's 1 1/4, and the outer diameter should be just a little over 1 1/2 inch. And this is very important because when you look at real parallel bars, the average diameter of parallel bars is around 1 1/2 inch, actually just a little over. So this is the perfect diameter that you want to use. And obviously this is a pre-cut size that I'm looking at, but 12 to 15 foot of PVC pipe should run you around between $10 to $13. So not very expensive. So that's where you should start. And I'll talk about the actual lengths you should cut them at and in what quantities in a moment. The next thing that you'll need is 4 Schedule 40 elbows that are rated, specified for 1 1/4 inch tubing. You also need 4 T's, 90-degree T's, also Schedule 40 for 1 1/4 inch PVC piping. Then you'll need 8 Schedule 40 PVC caps for 1 1/4 inch PVC piping. That's all the PVC components you'll need. Earlier I mentioned how much the PVC pipe costs for about 12 to 15 feet of it. The elbows, 4 of them, will cost you around $4, at least that's what it cost me. The tees cost me around $6. The 8 caps cost about $6 as well. You might be able to get that at a more cost-effective price. I personally got these from Lowe's, and Home Depot has similar prices, but if you go to a specialty place, you might be able to get a better price. But in general, still very cost-effective irrespective of where you get it from. In addition to the PVC parts, you should get some sandpaper, about 60 grit. That will be used to rough the different surfaces, so that one, the gripping surface will be roughed so that it feels similar to what parallel bars feel like. In addition to that, once you when you're ready to join the different parts together with glue, you should rough the surfaces so that the parts join a lot better. In terms of joining parts and glue, what I recommend is this Loctite 2-part epoxy that sets in 20 minutes, which gives you enough time to actually work with the different joints so that you can align them properly before the glue sets. And this particular type is actually designed for plastic components, so it's the right type of PVC gluing material you should use, and it offers very good strength, around 3,000 psi to be exact. So this is the one that I recommend. It runs about $6. The sandpaper was like $2, so both pretty inexpensive. When you're putting the parts together, you'll need something like a hammer that will help you kind of tap things into place. You know, I'm not advocating that you buy a hammer if you don't have one, but if you have one, that's what I would recommend. You should use a hammer, and if you don't, then use something in place of that. You also need some, basically, it could be newspaper or anything, just basically some kind of packing paper that you can put down on your working surface, so that when you're actually using glue and whatever else, so that you don't actually end up messing up different, you know, whether you're working on a table or a floor, you don't want to get things messy. So I would use that for kind of protecting different surfaces. And speaking of surfaces, you should have a nice flat surface to work with, very similar to this table that I have here. It will help you actually form 90-degree angles a lot better, instead of using your hand to kind of guess at the different joints on how they should be aligned, so that you get fairly well squared out parallettes. Finally, you'll need a small trash can to basically throw whenever you're sanding the different surfaces, you'll get very small grinds of PVC. You don't want to get on the floor, so you could just basically dump it all out in here. Dry cloth and a damp cloth, so that you can use them both for wiping the different surfaces before gluing and after you sand them. Sand the different surfaces especially, you want to be able to dust it off a little bit, so these two will help with that. So I've basically told you all the raw material that you'll need to start building your parallettes. The next thing to tackle is actually the different lengths that you need to cut the PVC pipe in. I recommend you start with cutting 4 8.5-inch lengths from the PVC pipe. This is going to be basically the upright portion of the parallettes, or the actual support portion of it. And the reason why I recommend 8.5 inches is because once you put everything together, it will actually put the parallettes about a foot above the ground. The reason why I think it should be about a foot is that that's basically the perfect height, which will allow most people to be able to do handstand push-ups with full range of motion. If you're doing press to handstands, you'll still have sufficient clearance, especially if you're a person who is first starting, who doesn't have a lot of flexibility. You'll need that additional clearance. But if you prefer to make the parallettes lower, I do not recommend that you go below 6 inches for the overall length of this part. Anything below 6 inches, it actually starts to get a little tricky in terms of putting all the different components together. Now, if you want it to go higher, I do not recommend it. 8.5 inches, I've learned, is actually pretty much that's the maximum length you can get to without things getting a little bit wobbly or unstable. So this is the length that I would recommend, and make sure that when you cut these, make them as equal length as possible, because this is going to be very crucial to make sure that the two parallettes are pretty even and you don't have any kind of lopsidedness on either side of the parallettes. Make sure that the surfaces are fairly flat, so that when you put everything together, you don't get any kind of crooked angles or anything like that. So this is the most critical piece. That's why I say I recommend that you start with this. If you screw them up, especially if you have additional length of PVC, then you can actually go back and actually make corrections. So start with this one definitely. The next important piece is the actual support portion of the parallettes. This is where you're going to be, whenever you're exercising, doing any kind of handstand movement, push-ups, whatever it might be, this is where your hands go. You'll need to cut 2 lengths in 2 feet sections. The reason why I recommend 2 feet is because anything longer actually starts to get a little too flimsy. Anything shorter, it can actually start limiting you in terms of being able to train different types of skills, particularly if you're a gymnast. If you're working, let's say, press the handstand, pirouette, it won't, if it's shorter than 2 feet, what happens is that you have not as much room for hand movement. So 2 feet length, 2 of them, that's what you need. And try to get them as close as possible in terms of length, but if you're off by a 1/4 of an inch or whatever, not as big of a deal for this part. Alright, finally, you'll need to cut 8 segments of 7.5 inch pieces. This is going to be for the base of the parallettes, where you're going to join 2 7.5 inches together with a T to give you to give the parallettes a stable surface to sit on. Different videos that I've seen, there's been recommendations for 5 to 6 inches. Personally, I found that to be a little bit too narrow. Where if you think about it, particularly in gymnastics, where when you're doing a handstand, and if you're doing handstand push-ups and to press whatever else, there's going to be a natural tendency for your arms to kind of push outwards, and during that time the parallettes are going to tend to want to tip. So you want to have a nice wide surface, or as wide as you can get it, so that the parallettes are as stable as possible. Especially if you're doing pirouettes and whatever else, that you will need to push off. So you want to keep the parallettes on a stable surface as much as possible. And I found that 7.5 inches is a pretty good length to work off of. So this is what I would recommend. Now, that's everything in terms of what you'll need to cut, and to basically show you all the different parts that I've discussed. It's all there. As you can see, the 4 segments of 8.5 inches, 2 segments of 2 feet over there, and the 8 segments of 7.5 inches, and the 8 caps, 4 elbows, 4 T's, and the other parts. So that's basically everything you need. Now we'll move on to actually what you'll need to do to prep the different surfaces to actually start putting them together. Okay, so to get started with actually preparing the different components for putting them together, you should start with the elbows and the 2-foot segments. So take one segment, and I have my trash can over here, and as you'll notice here, I've actually put the packing paper or newspaper, whatever you choose to use, on top of the flat surface that I'm going to be assembling all my parts on. And also the trash can I have here is actually sitting on packing paper, although you can't see it. So basically you take the PVC pipe, some sandpaper, and kind of rough the surface over the trash can so that the trash can actually captures all the debris. And you don't need to go overboard, just kind of rough the surface across thoroughly. I think that's about enough. Following that, take the damp cloth and run it across. So to clean it off. Following that, use the dry cloth to kind of dry off the tube. And by now you should actually start feeling the surface having better grip than the naturally smooth PVC surface that you were using, that you initially had. Now the current state that it's in, you may want to rough it up a little bit better later on once everything is assembled, but the minor roughing that you put on right now is actually primarily for adhesion purposes. So once you're done with the first tube, that away, and then do the same thing with the other tube. Once you're done with the other tube, what you'll need to do is take the elbows and then kind of take the sandpaper, blow it out like this, and then reach inside the surface. Just kind of rough it up a little bit. Not too much. This will help with that adhesion. And once you're done, take this, the damp cloth, and clean up the interior surface. So the roughing and the cleaning is very important in terms of when you actually start applying the glue. It will help when everything sets. It will actually hold a lot better. And once you use the damp cloth, use the dry cloth to take all the water out. And just check inside to make sure that you roughed it up enough. And in my case, it looks like I haven't in total. So if you need to, just get back in there, give it a little more. And repeat. With the cleaning. And that looks like I've done enough for this one, and repeat for the elbows as well. So I'm not gonna belabor the rest, so we'll move on to the next part after this. Okay, so the next thing is to actually put the pieces together. You start off with the handles first, which we sanded earlier. So the two-part epoxy here, basically I've cut the syringe, mixed it in equal parts. Follow the instructions very carefully to make sure that you get the best adhesion strength possible. Also use surfaces which you can throw away when you're mixing the glue together. But in general, be very cautious when you're using it. I'm using some latex gloves to protect my hands. I recommend you do something similar. You can use even dishwashing gloves if you want, but latex gloves that work really well. If you don't have gloves, just be very, very careful when you're handling this stuff. So once you have it mixed, the next thing to do is to actually apply it on one side, only one side of the elbow, not both sides. If you put it on both sides, then you're going to have to do some cleanup, and I've made that mistake in the past. It can get a little messy. If you do need to clean it up, do it very quickly using rubbing alcohol. If you don't do that, then you may have some problems actually trying to fit the parts together. You may need to do some additional sanding to get the glue off so that everything fits together nicely. So once you've put the glue inside the elbow, you put some on the edge of the tubing as well. And then you take the side that you put the glue on, and then you press it in on the side of the tubing that you also applied the glue. Look inside to make sure that the tube is butt up against the edge where the insert actually ends. And you'll be able to tell when you look inside. I can't, maybe if I bring it close up, I might be able to show it to you. As you can see, the tubing is kind of as far as it can go inside the elbow. So that's how you want it to look. And as you can see here, actually I should have mentioned earlier that I actually put the paper onto the working surface so that I don't get some glue on there, if I haven't mentioned that already. So I think I did. Alright, so once you've attached the first elbow, the next thing is to attach the second elbow. Once again, only apply glue to one elbow. Alright, so once you've done this, alright, once again, make sure you have the side that you put the glue on, and start off pressing it in, making sure that it's eyeball it so that it's fairly even. If you're having a hard time pressing it all the way in, just use a hammer to tap it in place. Now, next thing is carefully put this on the floor. And then what you do is you use the flat surface to help you even things out, like this. This is why I said you really need flat surface. It's like to make sure you get everything at 90 degrees. Making sure that there is no additional glue. If you want, you can actually put it down on the full surface to make sure everything is kind of sitting nice and even. For the most part, it looks pretty even. And I just basically eyeball it like this. There. It looks pretty even to me. So once you've done that, and in fact I can actually already feel the epoxy setting in there. So another 30 minutes or so and this part should be basically ready. Now I'll move on to actually assembling the base together. When you start to put the base together, you should actually start with the 8.5 inch piece first. This is the vertical component of the Parallettes. So sand really just the end parts only, since that's the part where we're going to be gluing together, and that's where the rough surface is going to play the most important role. The rest of the segment, unlike the handles, it's not important to actually rough it out, just the ends of it, as you can see here. The part that will actually end up going into the T and into the elbow. So you do that. Clean it off with a damp cloth. It's good. And you'll need to make sure this portion is actually sanded as well, so that it's sufficiently rough. Okay, so now that you've done that, next what you'll need to do is actually rough out the 7.5 inch components, which I'll show you next. First thing you need to do with the base is do a little bit of sanding to prep it. With this, you really need to just sand the ends of it here, because that's where all the glue is going to be sitting, and that's the part you want to focus on. Make sure you put everything right over the trash can and paper, so you don't get any basically filing all over the floor. Damp cloth, clean it off. Dry cloth to dry things off. Down. Now the T. Same thing as before. Take a small piece of sandpaper that you can hold in your hand and then get inside and basically sand the interior part to help with the joining with the glue. Alright, so you're satisfied. As always, damp cloth first to clean things out. Dry cloth to dry things off. So basically, let's do the same thing with the cap and the other segment of the tube, and we'll move on to the gluing portion next. So when you put the base together, I highly recommend that you put it together in the order that I'm going to show you here, so that you ensure that the base is nice and even. across the entire parallel. Between the 7.5 and 8.5 inches, actually put the 8.5 inch pieces into the tees first. That's very important because you really want to ensure that the height of the parallettes are even across the board, and this is your opportunity to make sure that you put the tube into the tee all the way in and properly. So you actually don't need a lot of glue, just a thin layer across the board, across. Then inside the tee after that. Try to do this as quickly as possible, because you do have only 20 minutes of working time. Make sure everything is pressed in all the way in, and I'll show you what I mean. You'll actually see the tube butted up against all the way to the end of the travel space within the tee. So that's very important. And you do that for all 4 bases to make sure that everything is even across the board. Once you put this piece in, the next thing you do is put the caps on. But because I have very limited time for working with the glue, I'm actually going to put the other tees on first, and then I'll show you how to put on the caps at the next scene. Okay, so for putting on the caps, it's actually pretty easy. You don't need just actually only need to put glue on the tube, since the caps, they're really not taking any loading. They're really for ensuring that they're for stability purposes, and I'll show you what I mean by that at the end of the video. Once you just basically press them in as far as you can, and that's really it. That's, do that for all of them, and we'll be ready to actually assemble the rest of the base after we're done here. Okay, we're getting close. Time to put the base together in full. Basically, you take the T portion here, and you put the 7.5 inch pieces at the bottom, so that you've got the full base T support. Now, earlier I said that the caps don't really play a structural role, and they're just basically shims, and this is basically what I mean. As you can see, the T has about an 1/8 of an inch gap at the base, so the caps basically shim out the tube so that it won't have a tendency to wobble and tip. So they don't really support any weight. They're just basically shims. So with that, let's start putting this all together. So once again, just a very thin coat. And ideally, you should really put the glue inside the cap, the T first instead of the tube. Kind of doing this in reverse order, but as long as you're careful, at the end of the day, it shouldn't matter. Okay, that's a little too much glue. This for now. Okay. That's enough glue in there. This, and just basically press it in. Now on this side. That's enough. And there we go. There you have it. So once you have that, just basically put the other pieces together and you're good to go. So one thing I should have mentioned when you actually put the base together, when you put the 7.5-inch pieces in with the caps on, there's one thing you should always keep an eye out on, which is the caps will have these studs or stumps or whatever they are. Make sure that they don't end up at the bottom where the base actually sits, because they'll actually create an instability point. So make sure they're always away from the bottom. Okay, home stretch. Now just to put the handle together with the legs. Start off by taking the handles and applying adhesive fairly generously, since this is actually a fairly important structural segment. All right, and then following that on the leg. And really wiggling it, making sure it goes all the way in, and relatively straight. Okay, that looks reasonable for now. And more adhesive on the other elbow. And finally, on the leg. Take this, just set it down on a flat surface. Basically, make sure everything is relatively straight on the base. Yep, looks good to me. And everything looks fairly even. So, there you have it. Okay, folks, looks like we're done. 2 sets of parallettes, the same height, and I've measured them off. They're actually a foot high, as I mentioned earlier. And the glue's still drying, but I did try them out right before I started this video to see how they feel, and they're actually pretty sturdy, so I'm pretty pumped about actually taking them to the gym to try them out. In fact, at the end of the video, you're going to see a couple of clips of me doing handstand push-ups, press the handstands, maybe a couple other tricks, I'm not sure, but I do want to demonstrate to you that if you follow the instructions that I've given here with an 1.25 inch diameter PVC tubing, you will get fairly strong, fairly versatile set of parallettes. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like for the video. Other than that, thanks for joining, and I hope you enjoyed the video.